TSITICA itself is an acronym that stands for Transforming Social Inequalities Through Inclusive Climate Action. And the overall sort of rationale for the TSITICA project is to try and understand how climate action, and by climate action we mean responses across different scales in responding to climate change, can essentially be pro-poor and act to reduce inequality. So putting poverty and inequality reduction at the forefront of what the climate action should deliver, rather than making climate action the main driving issue. We've been arranging these webinars over the last year or so as a way of bringing different perspectives around poverty, inequality, and climate action, both to the TSITICA project team, but making the webinars open to a wider audience, because we think a lot of what we're covering here is of relevance and of interest to the broader community working on these issues. So today's webinar topic is around the efficacy, if you like, and impact of adaptation interventions in developing countries. It's based on a research article that our presenters, Siri and Lisa, are lead authors on, and Claire can put the link to the paper in the chat for those who want to access the paper in more detail and improve Siri and Lisa's citation metrics. So please go ahead and have a look at that paper for more detail. The authors are two, I think, old friends of mine, actually. So Siri Eriksen is based at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and Lisa Schipper is at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, and both of them are co-authors with me and others at ACEIR in the current sixth assessment of the IPCC report. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Siri and Lisa. The format will be that we will have a presentation on the sort of content of their work, followed by a bit of a structured discussion where Siri and Lisa have prepared some issues they would like to get thoughts on from the audience. And we will also obviously allow for additional questions that aren't part of that structured discussion as well. So Siri and Lisa, please welcome. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Claire and Shona, and to the TSITICA network for inviting us here. I think it's particularly nice to present in this forum, and this nice bunch of people who work on themes that are so relevant to this paper. So I hope we'll learn as much from you as you'll learn from our presentation. The plan was that Colleen Focal would have also been co-presenting with us today. We're a little unsure if she can actually join us. So we'll take that as a bonus if she is able to join us after all. She had some unexpected events take place. I'd like to acknowledge Nick Brooks, Catherine Vincent, Marcus Taylor, and Morgan Scholes-Simmons as well, because we, seven of us, gave a presentation earlier for NORAD, Norwegian Aid, and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this presentation is in part based on some of that material that all these authors contributed. But actually, of course, I'm trying to shift to the next slide. I am sorry that the system is so slow. Okay, it seems to have frozen for me. It's actually completely frozen. That's unfortunate, but
I can share.
Yeah, should I stop sharing and then you share instead?
I can do it.
Yeah. Great, thanks. So while Lisa is sharing, I can just refer back to what Mark said. A bunch of us, actually 20 of us from across the world, from Kenya, Nepal, Australia, the US, South Africa, got together to write a paper that came out in World Development in January this year. If you go to the next slide, I can explain how that paper came about. Excellent. Yeah, so here you see the full list of authors. Excuse me. So the background to this was actually that the Minister for Development, Nikolai Astrup, came to the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And in that discussion that we had with him, I also said, there is a danger that some of the adaptation funding is used in inefficient ways, or it even contributes to reinforcing vulnerability among some groups. And that prompted his curiosity, and he asked for more information. So when I sent some emails out to people who've worked within adaptation, either directly in adaptation projects or studied them, a lot of enthusiasm came back and said, yes, we need to write about this because there really are some problems that we need to deal with. Adaptation is so important, it's urgent, and it's important that it's well funded, but it's also important that that funding actually goes towards good types of adaptation interventions and not inadvertently towards actually making things worse for some groups. So I think it tapped into some frustration within the adaptation community, and the paper has also had a lot of attention after it came out, not just among academics, but among Ministry of Foreign Affairs, different aid agencies, people in GCF. And I think it's resonated because we were able to say things in the paper that perhaps people have been worried about but cannot easily say within their own organizations. Basically talking about what are some of the problems with the way that adaptation is being carried out, what do we need to do to address that? Excuse me, can you shift to the next slide, Lisa? Thank you. So one of the motivations is that there is, not yet enough funding for adaptation, but there's certainly an increased funding for adaptation projects. So the significant adaptation needs, they're not quite matched with the funding that's there, but there's nevertheless a growth in funding, and adaptation represents an opportunity to rethink development interventions. What is it that climate change tells us about how development might be going wrong, how it should be different? How can we address social justice issues that emerge so clearly from, excuse me, climate change impacts? Are there ways that we can reconfigure the meaning and trajectory of development and engage in transformative adaptation? And as we started looking, we didn't find a study that actually had looked or had examined evidence to date of adaptation and its effects on vulnerability reduction. But there were many different empirical studies that looked at different cases of adaptation interventions and how those interventions affected social inequities and in fact affected social causes of vulnerability, or how it affected the most vulnerable groups or those groups already marginalized. So what we were trying to do then was explicitly to try to find out, well, what are the mechanisms through which adaptation projects, despite the best intentions, sometimes end up having negative effects in terms of actually reinforcing vulnerability among some of the most vulnerable groups. Yeah, Lisa, hold on, the next slide. So we ended up looking at 34 studies from all over the world, but in developing country contexts. Some of these were studies that we as authors knew about. We also did keyword searches, some snowballing from reference lists to look at scholarly and some grey literature. We then situated the findings in the broader adaptation literature, i.e. literature talking about adaptation processes, politics of adaptation, transformation, and so on. And we also drew on some of the authors' more practical experience of adaptation interventions. Some of the authors on this paper are, as well as studying adaptation, engaged in actual adaptation projects. So to try to interpret some of our findings in that light. Lisa, do you want to take over from now for a few slides?
Yes, sure. So I think sort of the authors we sort of had an understanding of that there was something about adaptation that really needed to be explored. And as we looked over these studies and a tremendous amount of other literature, I think we had nearly 200 papers that we ended up reading. We had to cut it back because World Development Rule was only 150 references. But essentially, it was clear from looking at this that adaptation is never a neutral or apolitical process. And essentially, there are three things that jumped out of us. First is that there's clearly something going on with the power relations between the actors who have the funding and are implementing adaptation projects and those people who are supposed to be adapted or adapting. Secondly, there's also clearly a confusion about where the knowledge is that we should be drawing on to make decisions about what are the most appropriate and effective adaptation solutions. So there's sort of pre-existing or limited knowledge that was there, and existing framings of problems, and this is then also trying kind of matched with ongoing development activities that may or may not have been consistent with the types of things that need to happen for adaptation, and to think about climate resilience more generally. And then finally, it was clear that there's a clear lack of critical reflection about how these power relations and existing framings actually lead to problems in adaptation interventions. So what we call sort of the dark side of adaptation, the retrofitting projects that were already there, development projects that then were supposed to be used as adaptation projects, or coercive transformation in the sense of trying to change somebody who won't be wanting to change, and then also accumulation by adaptation. So in the end, adaptation is really not a benign process that actually ends up creating new problems. So and as Siri said, I mean, it's clear that there has been a lot of reflection in a small-ish circle of critical adaptation scholars in thinking about, what is the relationship between adaptation and development. And I often cite a quote from a report that Ian Burton and John Susan wrote, I think from 2001 or 2002, that says that adaptation is sort of a window of opportunity for rethinking development. And from what we looked at, it's clear that that's probably not been the way that most of these agencies have thought about adaptation. Also, Claire Shakia from IIED, in a seminar that we had on the paper on the 3rd of March, said that the system is currently not working for the poorest communities and poorest governments, and given they hold the greatest risk, success can only be judged on their terms. So it really is a kind of a call for rethinking how adaptation is being implemented. And then the fact that we then identified so many issues that could be not, I would say, low-hanging fruit, because they're clearly difficult things to address, but maybe lower-hanging fruit, things that could actually be adjusted with effort. So the three sort of the typology that we identified was that there were patterns of the kinds of projects that they were reinforcing vulnerability, so existing vulnerability that was being made worse, or they were redistributing vulnerability. So they were saying, okay, we're going to solve the problem here, but then it ended up either downstream or down the coast or somewhere else for other people. And then finally, creating new vulnerability, so introducing new things that were making people vulnerable. And those were essentially the three kind of patterns that we noticed. And then the next step was to look at, well, how can we, what are the mechanisms through which this is actually happening? How is this outcome coming about? So just to kind of give you an overview of what we thought about, what we found in terms of reinforcing existing vulnerability. So there were sort of two kind of areas. There was where we saw donor utilities being prioritized to ensure rapid successive intervention, so quick wins. And this often meant going to the places that could be accessed more easily, or things that actually are where there are already projects that just needed a bit of a top up to make them a bit more of adaptation projects. And also that there was maybe a relationship or an existing kind of agreement in place, so that actually quickly things could be set up institutionally as well. But the challenge of this is that of course, that means that you've kind of working with people that you've worked with before, and that means you're not working with those people who are probably the ones who need more help because they haven't been getting previous attention. So that was sort of the first part of this. The second part is that it's clear that the elite, the people who already have power, are capturing most of the money and the opportunities that emerge from these adaptation projects. So that means that things like priorities and goals of adaptation interventions are determined from sort of a top-down way by a privileged group who maybe don't have any understanding for what the real issues are that the really vulnerable people are facing. And similarly, because of the way that certain things were designed, the most vulnerable people were often excluded. So you'd have things like, you'd have a certain set of requirements that you had to be able to fulfill in order to be part of a project. Like you had to have, in order for a project that dealt with land and agriculture, you had to be the owner of that land. So obviously most of the people who are probably the most vulnerable are not going to be land owners, and therefore they would be excluded from such an intervention. And as a consequence, you have sort of the wealthy and the influential people who monopolize the opportunities that come with these projects, or also even the funds. And this exacerbates existing conflicts and makes projects reliant on established power relations. So essentially, you're just sort of upping what's already there in terms of problems and just sort of amplifying them through this process of adaptation. Then the second thing that we've said is redistributing vulnerability. Here, it's clear that, and you can imagine this, I think, very concretely in terms of sort of infrastructure. For example, flood embankment protections that in one community kind of protect people, but that means that elsewhere the downstream there will be more flooding, and therefore those people will be more affected. And similarly, there were things like forest protection in Vietnam, an example where hydroelectric dams and forest protection are set up in order to help address flooding issues in a specific area, but then actually created problems with access to the forest and to the natural resources from the already very marginalized mountain populations. So that was the way how vulnerability was redistributed. And then finally, the introduction of new risks and sources of vulnerability. So that one is clearly also can come from infrastructure initiatives where you create things like with hard infrastructure. So kind of negative path dependencies where you kind of entrench certain occupation of high risk areas in Bangladesh, building of protection to sort of against coastal storms or cyclones, essentially creates an incentive for people to move closer to the coast simply because they think that this infrastructure is going to protect them. And actually research has shown that it's made people more exposed, and the mortality has increased in certain places because actually that infrastructure isn't able to keep people protected. And then you also have examples of local strategies that are being undermined. And so in Colombia, there was a top-down water adaptation intervention that was kind of really about the people who were in control, and it was less effective than the local initiatives that were essentially crowded out through this new initiative. And then finally, the sort of the idea of coercive transformation in pursuit of other agendas. So it's actually adaptation project is not really there to be about adaptation. There's something else going on behind it. And for instance, the cases that you have around the world of forced sedentarization of pastoralists. So in the Ethiopian lowlands, for instance, there's this climate resilient green economy strategy that they have. This undermines livelihoods, food security, knowledge and identity. And I think it's easy to say that there are a number of other similar initiatives around the world. So those are the way that we found these three types of vulnerability. And then we tried to say, well, what's actually the results here? What's going on behind this? And I'm just going to present the first two, and then Siri will do the others. So clearly, an insufficient understanding of the context. If you look at this, the oppression release model that is quite old now, it's from 1994, the idea that actually it sort of hazards interact with vulnerability, and that is where we're looking at the disaster or the risk. But actually there are multiple layers of vulnerability, and it progresses from these root causes through dynamic pressures and unsafe conditions, and that at every step of the way, the root causes are essentially amplified and create vulnerability. And this means that if you don't really understand what the root causes are, and you're only coming to address maybe the impacts of climate change, then you're likely to not really see this kind of progression being eliminated, and you're likely to actually see how this model will remain there. And so that's clearly, we're not having sufficient consultations with local people, not involving local people, not co-designing projects with local people are ways that you essentially can guarantee that you don't really understand what's going on. Oh dear, sorry, what's this? I hope you didn't see that. Yeah, okay, so that's and then also the other thing that I think is extremely frustrating, which is essentially that adaptation has become essentially taking on the same model as development projects, and that it's become, we call it projectized, and it means that rather than being seen as this big overarching, possibly governance process, or maybe just shift in mentality, adaptation is actually like projects, initiatives, and they then fall into the same traps as other development projects. The short time frames, the limited monitoring and evaluation, the very kind of focused on concrete things that can quickly be ticked off in order to check whether actually something has been accomplished. And the reality is, of course, that these are processes that you essentially have to think of as starting off, and that we're hoping that we're planting seeds of adaptation, and that these would then eventually protect people over time. It's probably not possible to say after 2 years, this project has been successful, because here we are with adaptation, given that we know that the climate is changing all the time. So that the consequence there is that we're not addressing these root causes. I'm sorry, I hope this, yeah. And then finally, so the other problem is, I think the reason that people aren't getting involved and there isn't this co-design of the local people is that essentially there is an idea that projects should be top down, and that community participation is difficult to engage in. And here is a photo from Peru, from Cusco, where actually Morgan, who is also one of our co-authors, he said that often these workshops, this is a an adaptation workshop that's taking place, and often they're held in Quechua, which is the local language in Peru, because a lot of women don't speak Spanish. So the other language would be Spanish, but in this case, they're held in Quechua so that women can also understand. But they're still predominantly led by the male technical experts. And so often they do try to separate so that men and women are held differently. But as you can see, all this gender dynamic and the language and power dynamic already creates a challenge. So if you're really serious about involving and engaging with local people, then you would need to go through the effort of doing all of these different groups in different languages with different constellations of people. And often that's not in the budget possible. So yeah, I guess that's probably a good example to explain how this inequitable participation plays out. And I might just pass it to Siri now for mechanism 3.
Thank you. So I hasten to add that, of course, there are lots of very good initiatives out there that are not necessarily doing what we are outlining here, and in fact are perhaps doing what we think is very useful in terms of adaptation is kind of experimentation of different ways of doing development. So what we're doing in this paper is identifying, when does that not happen, or why doesn't it happen in many cases? And one of the mechanisms there is what we call retrofitting adaptation. And I have to admit, this is personally quite an important topic to me. The Norwegian government just launched a strategy for climate change adaptation in development. And they've identified 4 or 5 different areas where they want the funding to go into. Climate services, nature-based solutions, infrastructure, and a couple more, which may be good. And on the other hand, I can also read into that Norway is already invested in RED+. And I think some ocean-based development type projects, it can be conveniently sort of, well, that's where we have the expertise already, so let's do our adaptation there. But then how does that frame what adaptation is? Or does it conveniently become a sort of, well, this is already adaptation, or the actors involved in those efforts kind of reframe what they do as adaptation, not, for any bad intentions, but, generally because, that's where their expertise is, and that's where they know best how to do interventions. But what this does also mean, I'm not saying that Norway will do that, I'll certainly do my best to ensure that that's not what happens. But there is, there is this danger, or there is this tendency that what's already going on in terms of development projects as regular development gets rebranded as adaptation with some small adjustment as a way of accessing climate finance. So in the case of Norway, the money that's going to go into climate change adaptation in developing country context, that's taken from the development aid budget. So the same actors who've been competing for the development aid budget will be competing for the adaptation budget. So what happens then, though, is that you don't engage the deep understanding of what vulnerability context is, or even what adaptation means in the context where you work, because you're already shaped by what you see as the development solution. And addressing social vulnerability and future climate risk becomes, in effect, a secondary or a poorly articulated goal. Sometimes there's also a more explicit sort of co-option by existing agendas that may be unsustainable and maladaptive. So you already have a sort of development agenda towards, whether it's agricultural intensification or it's some other sort of development ideology, and then adaptation just gets co-opted into that and reinforces that without really questioning whether this might actually be the type of development that's contributing to inequities and vulnerability in the first place. So essentially then nothing changes and development models are entrenched. The fourth mechanism is related to that, but has to do with the insufficient engagement with what adaptation success actually means. So essentially dominant development agendas come to define what adaptation success is, and adaptation success becomes almost the same as the existing measure of what development success will seem to be. So again, it's not necessarily through bad intentions, but because interventions are designed and financed by actors who are operating in their specific political and ideological context. There's not the space or perhaps much incentive to conceptualize what adaptation success is, especially if adaptation success would be something different from what you're already doing. So if you're competing for adaptation funding, you need, to show that what you're doing is actually constitutes adaptation success. Perhaps it's less attractive to start saying that what you're doing constitutes the opposite of adaptation success, and that you need to shift what your organization is doing. And these interventions are also often assessed using metrics that originate within or support these existing agendas. So basically, there's a poor conceptualization of what adaptation success is, and the goal itself is then assessed through metrics that are very close to the type of metrics that you used to have for development success. And so you come to entrench what you're doing rather than to actually rethink what adaptation success is and what you should be doing instead. There's a whole issue around monitoring and evaluation and how it's done, and how it's often, within financing institutions, it's often focused towards the short-term outputs, and often towards whether you delivered what you promised to deliver in terms of, amount of workshop, water pumps, or, number of inputs distributed to the recipient group, not whether you actually reduced vulnerability, especially among the most marginalized groups. So the indicators and the evaluation are often too narrow, and they don't give space for giving feedback about how the project might not actually have led to adaptation among the most vulnerable groups, or how it might have had negative effects for some groups. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? So I don't know whether this figure is legible to you, but we started trying to think about this idea of adaptation success or effective adaptation versus maladaptation, which has been seen in the previous publication, which I think, Lisa, you were part of. This continuum from maladaptation to effective adaptation. Now, of course, effective adaptation or adaptation success in itself is somewhat of a slippery term, because I think adaptation will always have, like any measure or any intervention, will always have positive and negative effects on some groups, timescales, or areas. So the question is more about assessing, well, what's acceptable or what's desirable, and having a conscious idea around that. And I think it's the lack of conscious thinking around that that leads to, the elite capture, the groups that are most heard to have their needs met, while the groups that are least heard, whether disabled people or children, who are most vulnerable in the first place, that their needs are met the least, or their position is even exacerbated. So on the left here are the mechanisms undermining vulnerability reduction: insufficient vulnerability understanding, inequitable participation, rebranding development as adaptation, insufficient conceptualization of adaptation success that can push adaptation interventions towards maladaptation. And on the right, we started charting out what are the avenues for more equitable vulnerability reduction. So one of the important issues here would be to shift the terms of engagement with vulnerability contexts. And that means placing the so-called vulnerable groups at the center, or their knowledge more at the center of designing, planning, implementing, evaluating interventions. It also means shifting how we engage with the vulnerability context, not just as a local context, but as a context that's shaped by processes that take place across scale. So it's not just a matter of enhancing the local capacity of a community. It's also about addressing, the political structures or economic structures or inequitable processes that are maybe taking place on national or international scale. So many of the driving forces of vulnerability are, of course, completely outside the scope of a local community to address on their own. Another is improving the learning processes within implementing organizations. And this alludes back to this issue of being able to engage with what adaptation success is, being able to explore and understand what is actually the vulnerability context, what are the drivers of vulnerability, what are the social inequities, and so on. So enlarging that space for learning and critical learning. Another is to make participation and the knowledge processes as the focus of intervention. And it's almost more important, you know, to what extent does an intervention allow for those types of processes as a sort of empowering adaptive learning process than, you know, how many water pumps are you able to install or how many households are you able to reach with a particular measure. And the fourth goes back to reforming finance structure, monitoring and evaluation, because of course, as long as you have a financing structure or monitoring and evaluation structures that push you into very sort of short-term projects and delivering certain types of products, it's also hard to do something about the other 3 points. So these are 4 potential avenues for pushing adaptation interventions more towards being able to address vulnerability context, towards being able to enhance the agency of vulnerable groups, reduce social political inequities, and critically then move towards a sort of post-adaptation that sees adaptation as including diverse values, interests, and forms of knowledges. So where the forms of knowledges are not just the scientific, not just the policymaker forms of knowledges, but the local knowledges, different types of local knowledges, sensory knowledges that may sometimes be contradicting and in tension with each other, but may create a sort of creative tension around reimagining different types of adaptation interventions. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so this is adaptation woman. We start to think, well, what is adaptation then? I mean, what is actually effective adaptation? And first of all, we think that there are important two legs of adaptation in terms of intervention, both looking at the social drivers of vulnerability and to engage explicitly with how climate risks are changing. So both of those need to be part explicitly of adaptation interventions in order for them to be effective. But then there are always, as I said, coexisting positive and negative effects of any measure on different groups or across time or across scales. And essentially, you know, steering which interventions or the character interventions are the 2 arms of politics and ethics. So politics around power relations, whose voice gets to be heard, and the ethics of, okay, what's acceptable? What sort of normative outcomes do we want? And I guess the global community has more and more adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as a sort of normative goal for what development should look like, for example, but there are always ethical choices being made. And those ethical choices need to be explicit and they need to be engaged with explicitly because there always will be both positive and negative effects. So then I think we'll move to the final slide. In our paper, we were sort of looking at, okay, what's gone wrong, or what is it that goes wrong in order to learn what needs to be done differently to be to ensure that more adaptation interventions are successful. I mean, what can I do to influence Norwegian aid to ensure that that funding really goes, you know, towards reducing the vulnerability of the most marginalized groups and not supporting those groups who are already more influential or relatively well off, or even development trajectories that increase climate risk or increase social inequities. So what does altering how we do adaptation mean? So one, it's about seeing adaptation being about how choices are made rather than identifying blueprint solutions. So that's why I'm, as a starting point, a little bit nervous about a Norwegian strategy already defining 4 or 5 solutions. But in case there are any Norwegians, other Norwegians here, I also see how it's necessary to anchor something, empirically or practically, an adaptation not just being about anything, and that you do need, some entry points, but it's about how you do it. Maybe it's about how you do the climate services, about how you do the nature-based solution, rather than saying, nature-based solution will always be good. A blueprint solution like that obviously sets actors up to implementing nature-based solutions in places where they're totally inappropriate, or in ways where marginalized groups lose access to land and find their drought coping strategies completely undermined, for example. So that's why we want to frame adaptation more as a multi-scalar learning and empowering process than the actual solution in itself. The other point is about flipping the knowledge relations. I mean, the adaptation arena really is quite top-down in the way that it's governed through international funding, through aid funding. And so it almost acts to be quite disempowering in itself, in sort of identifying vulnerable countries and identifying vulnerable groups, and then, directing what sort of solutions need to be put in place. So when we talk about post-adaptation, it's about trying to flip these knowledge relations. Is there potential for adaptation to actually flip these knowledge relations, where it's actually the values, priorities, worldviews of marginalized groups that end up steering adaptation, or even more broadly development? Are there lessons from adaptation projects that can actually help reshape development? And at all stages of planning, monitoring, and evaluation and implementation, to recognize vulnerable groups as heterogeneous. So it's not just say, well, we implement a measure in a vulnerable community. And to most of you, this is completely well known. I'm speaking to the converted here, but I'm surprised, at times when I speak to people who either fund or plan adaptation, how vulnerable groups are just seen as this one homogeneous group who need one solution that we will tell them how to do in the worst case scenario. We need to capture how these different values, priorities, and worldviews are continuously negotiated. Not about reaching consensus, but seeing how they're different. To include more deliberative processes for inclusive and contestatory politics. So part of this is actually, well, if an adaptation project, through its governance or through its knowledge processes, gives space to marginalized groups to actually contest some of the inequitable relations, and to be given more space in the public sphere, i.e. if a project, deliberately gives more space to disabled people so that they become part of the decision-making, become more part of the visible public scene, and are able to contest perhaps the way that projects are designed, or the way that physical environments are modified, then that deliberative process in itself is an important part of a sort of empowering adaptation process. And then to consider how vulnerability contexts are entangled in global processes. Final slide, please. I think we're very, very close to the end. So this leads us to the final point that, I mean, it's in itself that we have a Sweden and Norwegian talking about climate change, adaptation, development context. It's kind of, it's a bit contradictory in that, it's not about us telling them how to do things. The biggest scope is actually for the organizations, you know, whether it's NORA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway, the Green Climate Fund, to actually rethink, give space for learning within their organizations. It's not about sort of implementing transformation on other populations adapt to the local climate. So it is really about flipping some of those knowledge relations and starting that transformation in a sense at home, including then reform of finance structures, monitoring and evaluation. So Lisa, you had some discussion questions at the end. I think we put a lot out there, so we're very open for questions and discussions. And I have to say, you know, really the next step is to learn from all those, in a sense, successes that are out there, or the elements of how things are actually being experimented with and done much better than, you know, the studies that we looked at in our paper. So Lisa, do you want to take over?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I guess the idea behind these questions is really just to stimulate some thought. And I'm assuming that, and just having seen the participant list, that there are a lot of people who have a lot of experience here, and also maybe people who don't know this subject so well and might have some reactions to kind of how can this even be happening. So just in terms of trying to get stimulate some conversation after this now. You know, I guess we're curious if you think there are things that we missed that you have observed that might be additional reasons for adaptation going wrong. And as Mark earlier kind of noted, this could be interpreted as sort of adaptation going wrong according to what we think adaptation should be, but it could also be sort of projects that set out to do something and then they fail. And in particular, obviously going wrong refers to making people more vulnerable. And also then what, I mean, one of the biggest research questions, or I think it's a policy question as well, is really how can we stop maladaptation from happening? It's really difficult. It's very easy to see with hindsight that, oh, this went wrong. It's much more difficult to see as something is happening, what all, we obviously in this project, we've identified, or in this paper, we've identified a number of things that we think are kind of probably part of the recipe for disaster, if you want, but what could be additional things that we might be able to see in advance. And then also, who are the actors who might be really important to make sure that we can avoid maladaptation? Or who has the biggest responsibility for tackling vulnerability to climate change in general? So which institutions, policies, and processes might support them? And yeah, and I guess also if you have any examples of maladaptation that you want to share with us, but you know, those are not the only questions that we can discuss. It's just a way to stimulate some thinking now.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And just please do raise your hand. We've got quite a big audience, so it's going to be hard to keep track of everyone. And I do think it's better to sort of give a verbal input than to try and expect us to keep track of all questions in the chat. So verbal input's preferred. Lisa, do you want to handle this, or shall I just see who's put their hand up and then let them speak, and then you can kind of respond, so you don't have to do multitask? Would that be helpful?
Yes, I can't actually, I'm not sure if I can even see who the participants in the chat are when I have my screen shared, but I could also remove the screen share maybe. Do you think that's good?
So Mark Tabitha has got his hand up. So Mark, do you want to go ahead? And maybe, Mark, just introduce yourself. Just tell us your claim to fame before you started.
So my name is Mark Tabitha, and I'm a lecturer at the University of East Anglia. My claim to fame is I work at the university that was hacked all those years ago. Anyway, no, so joking aside, I mean, thanks both for your presentation. I really liked your paper, and it's nice to hear you kind of talk about it, provide, I guess, a little bit more insights into your thinking and why it came about. But I guess the question that I had was just picking up on a point that Siri, you made when you said that you know, a lot of what you're saying is you're really kind of preaching to the converted in terms of the audience that we have here. And I guess if that's the case, then it would be really good to hear your reflections on, if you like, what have we done wrong? You know, if we've known all of these things for a while, we've clearly been ineffective in being able to communicate this to policymakers, to decision makers. You know, we know that vulnerability and vulnerable groups aren't, or they're very different and all of these sorts of things. Yet that message is obviously not getting through to people that are responsible for implementing adaptation, to take one example. So I guess a reflection on either what we have done wrong up until now, or how can we improve or do better in the future to try and communicate these things that I think a lot of us have known about for some considerable time.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Shall I go ahead first, and then Lisa, if you want to add, you can go ahead. What did we do wrong, since we already know a lot of this? Well, didn't we not write enough papers, maybe, or did the policy makers not read our papers? That's a bit flippant. I mean, but it has to do, I think, a little bit with the relationship between critical academic research and those who implement adaptation projects. You know, to what extent have the messages that we have had for, you know, maybe at least a couple of decades being taken up, or even has there been space to take that up when there's been a rush to, you know, we must implement some good adaptation projects, let's take the low-hanging fruits. Is there space for the critical adaptation scholars who say, oh no, wait a minute, that's not going to work? I think it's mutual, you know, in a way. Perhaps we've also not been good enough at engaging with practitioners in terms of, in ways of showing, you know, how to do things different, not just say, don't do this. And it's quite encouraged by the fact that this paper has been read by so many and is actually having an impact. And I think that relates to the fact that both practitioners, policymakers, and researchers are starting to have some of the same insights, and it resonates. And you know, there's a frustration that let's not repeat mistakes. We can't afford to do that in the context of climate change or scarce adaptation funding. But yeah, I'd love everyone's insight about this. But I mean, I think part of that frustration was also motivation for this paper. You know, that we know that many of these things are going wrong, but let's document it properly, and let's engage with policymakers and those who make funding decisions, those who implement projects, to see how things can be done differently. Lisa, do you want to add?
Well, I mean, I might add, I think there's been a couple of kind of key policy moments that have sort of led to this in some ways. And I mean, it's hard without, I mean, it's sort of what I look at when I look back at it and I think, but I mean, I do think very much the fact that Kyoto Protocol was sort of, you know, the US said, we're not going to ratify Kyoto Protocol, that it took so long for the Kyoto Protocol to actually become ratified that the UNFCCC discussions had to refocus and think about something else. And adaptation kind of popped up. And I mean, I do have a bit of a pet peeve, because I always felt strongly that adaptation, it's not part of the convention very explicitly, but it also really would have fit much better in a different context. And I do think there was some sort of, it was a bit of a battle and a struggle to get adaptation on the agenda and the policy agenda. And that then, it was kind of, you know, the people who responded to it were the development actors. And they were like, oh yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to take this on, and we're going to build this into something that actually we already have a mechanism for, which is our development projects. So, I mean, you know, we can argue about it, but I do feel that there probably is something about that, the way that it actually got set up, and it kind of got on the wrong track from the beginning. And then in addition, all of this ridiculous debate about sort of how to fund adaptation or climate change in general, but the notion of additionality, and that all of these funds had to have additional ways of proving how they're sort of adding climate change on top of existing funds, and that any project had to show what, this is how much money, additional money, addressing climate change is going to cost. So I think there's some roots there that have much more to do with kind of policy and opportunities that were grasped by probably maybe the wrong actors, but with the wrong pressure, I guess.
Great.
I saw that Gina's commented that she has to leave soon.
Yeah. Yeah, perhaps we could just take a couple of questions at a time, and then you can maybe sort of see if you can find a way to sort of talk to multiple questions, because they might be overlapping. But so Gina's asked if she can jump the queue. I don't know if that's fair or not, but I'll let her ask her question, and then perhaps we can go to George Uta after that, and then we have a couple of other questions waiting. So Gina, your assertiveness has paid off.
Thank you, and I'm remembering the ethics little point on the adaptation ban. So, but thank you for entertaining me. But I was just thinking about your presentation, and I've just, I was telling Lisa that I've just been teaching a postgrad class where they've had this paper as one of their set papers. But in the class this morning, we were just looking at Butler et al.'s paper from Indonesia, where they've been looking at adaptation pathways in a 4-year project. And so they've really done so much of what you've said, inclusive and participatory and learning, etc. And what they found is they worked at the sort of community level more, but then the policies and the kind of more decision makers didn't change. And so what I was reflecting on your presentation and this paper I've just shared with my students and the work I do is that it's very hard to have a project team that works well at the local level and does all that engaged stuff, and at the policy level that shifts policy and gives space to kind of adaptation that sort of transforms at that level. And so it feels as though both of those need to come in, but it's very hard for one project to do that. And so you land up working more at the policy level with those actors, and you don't then bring in the local perspective sufficiently, or you do the other. So it's just something that feels very real and challenging, and I'm not quite sure how you overcome that well without having this massive project that has too many discrete parts. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, just George, do you want to go ahead so we can try and do 2 questions at a time?
Yes, thank you, Mark. I must thank the presenters for the presentation, but I must say this is a very provocative article from, at least from my perspective, very provocative. Just 2 quick comments. One is that I thought that there should have been a little bit of demonstration by way of, say, a case study to demonstrate. When I saw, say, 56 projects, and I was very keen to know 1 or 2 that went wrong. And therefore, I thought that in the absence of a detailed case study, there could be I'm not so persuaded that adaptation has all gone wrong, but that's my first comment. The second one is that power relations, at least from my perspective, even in terms of some of these projects, are extremely complex down, even if they seem to be so. And I think that this speaks, in my view, to the theoretical grounding in which the kind of research you did took place. Because if the gentleman that ACDI positioned the other day, Achille Mbembe, has really done a lot of work on this power from law. But I'm happy you you mentioned the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, and I think what I would call the suspect classification between developed and developed countries, which you find in the UNFCCC, and you also find it in the Paris Agreement. This is partly the originating problem in terms of how adaptation projects are actually framed in the developing country context. So those are my three.
Super. Maybe you guys can think of how you can respond to both those questions. So let's, not that related, but maybe one each or something like that.
Okay, I'll try to make a start. I mean, I feel like they're insightful words of wisdom rather than questions necessarily. So they stand well on their own feet. But yeah, I mean, thank you for pointing out the issue of the way adaptation has been framed with that split between development and developing and non-developing country contexts. It's in itself problematic, and in itself starts framing adaptation as something that sort of experts in the developing country context fund and carry out to help developing country populations. So the whole conceptualization of what adaptation is sort of goes wrong, I feel, often at the start, and feeds into global power inequities. Morgan Scholes-Simmons has written a paper about mainstreaming that gets to some of this in more detail that some of you might have an interest in reading. I think it came out in 2020. Yes, George, more detailed case study. Indeed, actually, the original background paper we wrote to NORAD and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we had more space, and we did have more detailed case study, but simply for a journal article, we couldn't do it. And I guess I hasten to add that the article also wasn't about kind of shaming and blaming and saying, oh, look, that agency or that project's done something wrong. It's more about showing the elements that actually take place in many projects that go wrong. Yes, indeed, more detailed case studies are useful. I guess if you do go then to the references to the case studies that were looked at, you'll be able to find more detail. Yeah, Lisa, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, I guess the other point, Gina's question about how you actually design projects that would avoid these problems. And I guess it's worth mentioning that that's kind of the next step that we're trying to think about, is how, what would be actually suggestions for how to avoid these problems. So that, yeah, and I think, the issue of different framings and understandings and kind of starting points, demands, agendas, which funders have what targets that they need to be met and so on. I mean, it's quite, I think there are a lot of things that are probably very challenging and will take time to change. And then there are other things that might be a little bit easier to adjust. But awareness is probably one of the biggest things that we could help to bring to the table. And then I just thought maybe to mention, I mean, I think George, the issue of power, I think it's obviously so complicated. It's not just a matter of, these people have money and they have power and therefore they can make the decisions. Obviously, there are a lot of things going on, and there's things that have to do with sort of alliances that might have sociocultural ties or sociocultural roots and politics and that sort of thing as well that matters. So and these are relative and shifting all the time. So it's a complicated thing. We have to be cautious not to just say, power is a sort of simple thing here that we need to address. It's more complicated than that.
Great, thanks. So next on my list is Stephen or Stefan. I don't know how to pronounce your name, sorry, and Susie after that. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Stephen Wojniecki, and there were in terms of reframing, there was a couple of things you didn't mention, which were transformation, or you didn't mention transformation so much, at least, and loss and damage. And I was wondering, in terms of vulnerability being redistributed, if adaptation also produces loss and damage, right? And kind of taking into account how loss happens through adaptation, not just because adaptation doesn't happen, if that might be an opportunity to get to an adaptation that we want to see that is more transformative, that doesn't kind of allow for even transformative forms of adaptation to be so blunted and deflected and co-opted and so on. Is that one potential avenue? I'm not sure. Sorry, it's not such a specific question.
Hi, do you want me to go ahead? It's
Please do,
Susie
yeah.
here from Leeds. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for fascinating presentation. And we've been working on similar sort of case study related and finding similar things in some of the work we're doing. But two things that kind of spring to mind and maybe I was keen to discuss. It links to, I think, Amy's chat message in the chat, and also probably Gina's point about sort of the sectoral nature of implementation of anything around agriculture. We're working a lot on food systems, and adaptation is obviously, you know, being mainstreamed into agricultural and food systems, but ultimately the ways, the competition across the policies and the contestation across policies to do with agriculture, forestry, you name it, development, really needs a look. So it's about how we take those insights from the local case studies and up into policy and feed those into policy, and that are so sectorally facing is something we're thinking about and working on a bit in some of our GCRF work. But the other question is about how we transform the research we do within the institutions we're working in, many of us in university type environments, funded by sort of more traditional means, which obviously are decimated a little bit at the moment in the UK and for sure, but how we as researchers transform the work we do and the methods we're using to ensure longitudinal work that really follows processes and studies processes. So yeah, keen to hear what you have to say about that.
All right, thanks. So
oh, sorry.
I'm just prompting you to decide who's going to.
Okay. So let me see. I wanted to respond to Stephen's question or comment or question. I guess what's interesting is to think about, you know, I gave talked about this paper to the FCDO in the UK, and there were comments back saying, why do we even talk about maladaptation? Why don't you just use the phrase do no harm? In terms, you know, it is kind of the same philosophy. It is a term that exists in humanitarian spaces. It's a term that's been around for a long time. And in fact, the 2006 Wires paper that Alex Magnan and I and Siri and Gina and a bunch of people were on maladaptation. In fact, that was kind of one of the starting points about sort of do no harm. I guess I'm not so familiar with that phrase, but I think the idea that, you know, we don't want to see loss and damage as a consequence of adaptation is, I think you know, it's sort of like intuitive, yes, but at the same time, what we're seeing is, yes, there are these problems. And I guess in the kind of, I was thinking about this in terms of defining maladaptation in another paper, and really, you know, you could also see it as kind of just externalities. Like an economist will say, oh, you know, something is going to happen over there, and that's always the way it is. And in actually the reality is, yes, there are always trade-offs, right? And so I think what's specific about this is that there's really, you know, somebody's setting out to design something and they're doing it badly and it's resulting in problems. And that's why I think, just Siri has mentioned a few times, like, let's be clear, there are lots of good projects as well, but it's just that there are enough bad projects that are causing problems that we really need to wake up. And like Siri also said, the fact that we've gotten so much attention from various donors suggests that they are very much aware that this is an issue. And so, yeah, it has resonated with lots of different actors. I guess I might just park it there and let Siri respond. Because I spoke.
Yeah, thank you for very inspiring and insightful comments. And on the aspect of you know, the bridging between the local and sometimes very sectoral implementation of adaptation projects, or even when it's not so sectoral but very community-based, you know, how do you link that with working at the policy level? And how do we change the way we do research? I think these issues are linked. I think it alludes to opening up as part of research and adaptation projects, to do the type of deliberative dialogue, policy dialogues, to use the projects to open up that space between the policy and the local level community. I'm using sort of community now in a generic way, but the different actors, perhaps at the village or local level, and the different vulnerability, causes of vulnerability, the different interests, the different knowledges that are there. And maybe that means more long-term projects, because you need to build trust over time. You need to build those relations between the policy level and the researchers and the people who are often sort of recipients of adaptation. So I think it takes working much more long. That's a challenge to how we get research funding. It's a challenge to how we get adaptation funding. I'm working now in Norway to try to set up sort of learning hub as a kind of space for, at least in Norway, to have space for meeting between civil society and the implementers of adaptation projects, the funders of adaptation projects, and researchers, to see, what are some lessons about how one can bridge some approaches from civil society, from adaptation interventions that might be taking place on the ground with policymakers and with researchers. And it takes a lot of time. That doesn't go into a publication. That doesn't go into citation metric. So it takes for us maybe to be a bit courageous in putting our time elsewhere than what would give us, promotion or credit within, or even funding within our systems. Yeah, so I think we work within some constraints, but I think there's also, it takes doing research in different ways and integrating different types of knowledges in different ways from what we've done before, while remaining critical and understanding how the interaction between those different knowledges takes place. That's not neutral. There's the power relations that take place within these knowledge relations. Not a complete answer, but those are some reflections, and I'd love to hear some more reflections from the rest of you on that issue. I think it's critical.
Thanks. So we have one last question from Darlington. So Darlington, could you go ahead? And then I had a question that I wanted to throw in at the end as well. Thanks. And I see Jack as well has his hand up now.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the thought-provoking presentation. For me, I wanted to start with kind of a comment around what you have, the questions which you put right at the bottom, asking about examples where I think maladaptation took place. I think I would want to, from quite a personal side, that I remember 2006 and 2008, there were kind of successive droughts where I come from, and my parents wanted to go and get agriculture inputs, and they were told no, they were removed from the list because of the fact that the children, including myself, don't attend particular political meetings. And yeah, it's just an example of what you raised in terms of how that really, if it's not taken into consideration, how it can really lead to people who are vulnerable, and they end up not benefiting in the end. So just that one comment that I wanted to raise. Then secondly, looking at there's this diagram you put right around kind of a spectrum where you say effective adaptation and maladaptation, kind of a continuum. I was just wondering, is it possible to rather think around it in terms of interlocking loops rather than a straight line? from one end to the to the other. So yeah, that's what I wanted to bring.
Great, thanks. Jack, I'll let you go first, and then I'll just come in with a quick comment, and that we'll probably we'll have to close off after the response to this set of comments and questions. So Jack, please go ahead.
Great, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Lisa and Siri, for a great talk and paper. In the paper, you talk about how how post-development as a movement was sort of unable to reverse some of those unequal structures in question. How the post-adaptive turn should learn from that. I was wondering whether you had sort of any suggestions as to what, if anything, this post-adaptive turn that you propose should learn from the successful failure of post-development to catch on in development practice.
Cool. So I see now that I'm telling everybody there's no more time for questions, the hands are coming up. So Shona, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks very much, Lisa and Siri. It's just connects so well with the work we're doing, particularly the work package 4 in the TSITICA project, and it just stimulated a whole lot more ideas for me. But I just wanted to ask a question and get your views on what we're having to do now in our work package after the funding was cut by the UKRI. So we basically had to halve what we were spending for this next financial year. And a logical place to cut was the fieldwork. And the fieldwork, we were going to do in-depth case studies of adaptation projects or interventions in 3 countries, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. But with the funding cut, we've come up with a kind of new option to kind of go forward. And that would actually be doing maybe some in-depth interviews and maybe a wider kind of survey. Using that framing of procedural and recognition on distributional equity, but also other aspects that you've also referred to in your talk. But actually having to talk to practitioners or those that kind of link to practitioners, so it could be evaluators of projects, etc., and look at their perspectives around these equity dimensions of the interventions. But we are concerned about potential bias there. But recently come across a publication that did very similar for payment for ecosystem services, so I guess a type of nature-based solution. But I was just wondering, in your experience, what do you feel there's a real danger of bias, or do you think we can actually get a sort of honest perspective from practitioners? And, as you mentioned, maybe they feel more comfortable in this type of space to speak out than they would be in, for example, in relating to their funders. So just your perspectives. Thank you.
Right. Please go ahead, guys. If you can remember all of those questions.
Okay, Lisa, do you want to go? You did a bit of nodding there, so go ahead.
Okay, maybe that's just to loosen up my muscles. I guess I wanted just to, I was just thinking about, I guess quickly on Shona's question. I think, this is really interesting. In fact, I had a student who I think last summer, she wanted to understand if there's such a concept as just adaptation, and went to talk to a bunch of different practitioners and researchers to kind of understand what their perspective is. It's like, do you actually, when you do adaptation projects, do you think about justice? And found that it's not that people aren't interested, it's just that that's not part of what how the projects are designed. And so, I don't know if it's an issue of whether people will be honest, or whether they're just, it's not part of the scope of what they're looking at. But having said that, also, I think it's interesting that the UK, we can say a lot of bad things about the whole funding situation right now. And I think the ironic thing is that they're talking about a race to resilience while they're also meanwhile cutting all this development aid, which is essentially not going to help with the race to resilience. And in particular, But interestingly, FCDO is rethinking a lot of what kind of where funding needs to go for climate research, and they've had very extensive consultations going on. I think they're still going on, actually. So I don't know. I guess I think I would say go for it, and there's possibility that they will be honest with you. And then just quickly in terms of the post-adaptation, I think. So though I kind of see post-adaptation as the two parts that, in one way, post-adaptation marks the fact that we now have sufficient empirical experience with adaptation to actually be able to make some comments about whether it's working and what it is, which a lot of the stuff that I certainly was inspired by, and I think, that we read back in sort of the early 2000s, was very much still kind of theoretical. So a lot of the thinking has been grounded in that kind of, or it's based on experiences of disaster risk reduction. So we now kind of can say, all right, here we have a new way of understanding adaptation because we have experience on the ground, but also it very much, is trying to say, look, post-development has been arguing, is a way to argue about how development is not, it's essentially a continuation of colonialization, and therefore we need to rethink who's benefiting from this process. So it's sort of both a critique of the current thing and also saying, look, we now actually have more meat to be able to say something about it. Yeah, I just had that one.
Yeah, thank you again, everyone, for raising really interesting points. And I think, okay, so the issue that you raised, Shona, about whether there will be a bias, yes, I'm sure there'll be a bias, because we all have biases. I mean, I really love the way that you're taking then equity in the conversation. And I think that should glean some really interesting things, compared to just taking adaptation or impacts. But to explicitly talk about equity and maybe exploring what equity, maybe it's enough just to understand what equity means to different actors and how they even perceive it. Maybe that's, enough. And perhaps be able to understand what is it, that would limit what you would see as a more frank representation, or what is it that creates certain biases? I mean, we all have biases, right? So it's not a matter of ever getting a response that's unbiased. Even this presentation is obviously biased to my my theoretical frameworks and so on. But yeah, I think, Shona, you probably know all of this much better than I do. So I don't know that I can really give very good advice as such. I just thought it was really interesting what you brought up, and how what one gets out of conversations, and to what extent can a research project and the way that the conversation is framed with policymakers or practitioners, how that can create a space for a different sort of knowledge than perhaps what they feel that you expect to hear, or that they feel their funders expect to hear. And then I just very quickly, I know we're running out of time, but Darlington, I thought you had a brilliant point about possibly interlocking loops rather than straight line in that figure. It's always bothered me a bit, this kind of, do you have effective adaptation on one side and then maladaptation on the other side, whereas I think, in a way they coexist, depending on, maladaptation for whom, effective adaptation for whom. So maybe our first step is to really work on that figure. I hasten to add that figure was not part of our original paper. It was more part of our presentation to try to think about, what does that mean for moving forward. So it really is very much work in progress, and maybe, our collective heads would be able to work that figure into something much more useful. So yeah, if this is the final word I get, then I would really like to extend a big thanks to this group for spending your afternoon or morning or whatever time zone you're in listening to us, and for providing such insightful comments.
Yeah, and thank you to Lisa and Siri for donating their time as well. I hope that it's been useful for you, and it's certainly been very useful for CITICA team. So we really appreciate the time you've given to us. And I'm guessing that if people have follow-up questions, they know where to find you. You're not hard to find online. So I'm assuming you would be okay to receive follow-up emails if anybody's after something in particular from you. So yeah. Okay, so just to let you know, all of the CITICA webinars are recorded and available on the, well, probably from the CITICA webpage, but also on the CITICA YouTube channel, so that will all be there. And thanks for all the comments. Those will also be recorded, and we'll try and just keep a track of the ones that weren't talked about in the actual webinar, that weren't discussed, and yeah, make sure that we take those on board as well. So thank you very much to everybody, and please have a restful weekend when it eventually arrives.